When bikers threatened Clint Eastwood, they weren't aware that he had a black belt in karate. It was a late afternoon when the sun hung low over the desert town, painting the faded storefronts in soft gold, a place where time seemed to stand still. That peace was shattered by the roar of motorcycles. One by one, a gang of bikers thundered into town, their engines growling like a pack of wild beasts. There were 6 of them, dressed in black leather, their jackets scrawled with ominous symbols and worn patches. They laughed and shouted as they cruised down the road, their presence as unwelcome as the storm clouds on the horizon. Locals froze mid-step, exchanging uneasy glances before retreating indoors. Curtains were drawn, doors shut, and the town grew eerily still. Moments later, a dusty blue pickup truck rolled into the gas station across from the diner. The driver stepped out, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. He moved with unhurried precision, his weathered jeans and button-down shirt blending into the desert backdrop. Clint Eastwood. His face bore the marks of experience, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. He looked like any other traveler stopping for a bite, unremarkable to those who didn't know better. Clint parked near the diner and walked inside, the small bell above the door jingling softly. He chose a table near the window, ordered a coffee, and leaned back, his gaze fixed on the street. Outside, the bikers were still roaring with laughter, but Clint remained composed, sipping his coffee as though he had all the time in the world. The tension in the air was palpable, but Clint didn't seem to notice or care. The peace inside the diner was short-lived. The door burst open, and the gang of bikers stormed in, their boots stomping against the floor as they laughed and jeered. The quiet hum of conversation and clinking silverware evaporated, replaced by the bikers' raucous noise. They scattered across the diner, claiming seats and leaning against counters as though they owned the place. One of them whistled loudly at the waitress, a young woman with a forced smile that barely hid her discomfort. "Hey, sweetheart, how about some service over here?" he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Clint watched the scene unfold from his corner table, his expression unreadable. He didn't move, didn't flinch, as the gang's noise filled the small space. His eyes, however, tracked their every move, sharp and steady beneath the brim of his hat. The waitress glanced toward him for a fleeting moment, her wide eyes silently pleading for help, but Clint remained still. The bikers hadn't noticed him yet, too consumed by their loud antics. One of the bikers, a burly man with a scruffy beard, swaggered toward Clint's table. As he passed, he bumped into it, hard enough to make Clint's coffee cup rattle. The biker paused, turning to look at Clint with a smirk. "Oops," he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Didn't see you there, old-timer." Clint didn't react immediately. He picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and set it back down with deliberate care. "No harm done," he said evenly, his tone calm but firm. His gaze met the biker's, steady and unyielding. The smirk faltered for just a moment before the biker chuckled and moved on. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut, but Clint remained composed, his every movement deliberate. He wasn't looking for trouble, but it was clear, if trouble found him, he'd be ready. The diner's uneasy quiet didn't last long. The bikers, emboldened by the lack of resistance from the staff and patrons, began to take over the space. One flipped through the jukebox options, loudly complaining about the lack of good music, while another leaned across the counter, tapping the waitress's notepad with mock impatience. But it wasn't long before their attention shifted to the one man who hadn't flinched since they entered Clint. The leader, a tall, broad man with a leather vest covered in faded patches, noticed Clint sitting calmly at his table. He nudged one of his buddies, nodding toward Clint. "Look at this guy," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Sitting there like he owns the place." His boots echoed on the floor as he approached Clint's table, the other bikers watching with amused grins. "Hey, old man," the leader said, leaning over Clint's table. "You deaf or just slow? I said you're sitting in my spot." His tone was mocking, a mixture of bravado and expectation that his target would cower like the others. Clint didn't even look up right away. He took another sip of his coffee, savoring it, before finally meeting the biker's gaze. "Didn't see your name on it," he said evenly, his tone as calm as still water. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, locked onto the leaders with quiet intensity. The biker chuckled, but it was strained. "You got some mouth on you for an old-timer," he said, straightening up. "Maybe I ought to teach you some respect." Behind the counter, the waitress froze, her hand trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. Outside, a few locals had gathered, peeking nervously through the windows. They whispered among themselves, trading stories about the gang's rough reputation. Yet their murmurs always circled back to one thing: the stranger who wasn't backing down. The leader smirked, leaning closer again. "What's the matter, cowboy? You scared?" Clint set his coffee down, his movements deliberate, and finally spoke. "Not scared. Just wondering if you're as dumb as you look, or if this is an act." The words landed like a hammer. The other bikers laughed nervously, unsure if they should follow their leader's lead or step back. The leader's grin twisted into a sneer, his pride clearly stung. "You just made a big mistake, old man," he growled, stepping back as if preparing for something worse. The tension in the diner rose to a breaking point. The gang, feeding off their leader's frustration, became bolder. One of them shoved a stack of plates off the counter, sending them crashing to the floor. Another knocked over a chair as he passed, the sharp clatter making the waitress flinch. They laughed loudly, the sound harsh and jarring in the once cozy diner. "Hey, sweetheart," one of the bikers called to the waitress, waving her over with a smirk. "Why don't you bring me a real drink? None of this coffee crap." He grabbed a ketchup bottle and squirted it across the table, the red streaks splattering onto the floor. "Oops," he said with mock innocence. "Guess I made a mess." The waitress hesitated, her eyes darting between the bikers and Clint. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The other diners sat frozen in their seats, avoiding eye contact and hoping the gang wouldn't turn their attention toward them. Clint's chair scraped softly against the floor as he stood, the sound cutting through the chaos like a knife. The bikers turned toward him, their laughter fading into a tense silence. Clint stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, until he stood in the middle of the room. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable weight. The leader turned toward him, grinning as if Clint's words were the punchline to a joke. "You again? You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he said, stepping closer. "You think you're going to stop us, Grandpa?" Clint's gaze didn't waver. He looked past the leader, sweeping his eyes over the entire gang. "Leave the staff and the customers alone," he said, his tone calm but firm. "You've had your fun. Now it's time to go." The bikers burst into laughter, the sound echoing off the walls. "Listen to him," one of them said, doubling over with mock amusement. "Thinks he's John Wayne or something." The leader, emboldened by his crew's reaction, stepped right up to Clint, close enough to feel the heat of his calm stare. "Here's the thing, cowboy," he said, his voice dripping with derision. "We don't take orders from washed-up old men." Clint's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The room was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. The bikers didn't notice how the other diners had stopped breathing or how the waitress clutched her notepad so tightly her knuckles turned white. They didn't notice the storm brewing behind Clint's calm exterior, but they were about to. The air in the diner felt thick, as though the tension itself was a living thing, pressing down on everyone in the room. Clint stood still, his hands resting calmly at his sides, his expression unreadable. The bikers chuckled among themselves, their leader still standing toe-to-toe with him, clearly amused by the stranger's apparent lack of fear. Clint finally broke the silence, his voice low and measured, carrying a gravity that seemed to cut through the noise. "Walk away," Clint said, his tone as steady as the desert wind. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The leader smirked, his arms crossing as he tilted his head back in exaggerated disbelief. "Oh, really?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "And who are we dealing with, huh? Some old guy who watched too many cowboy movies?" The rest of the gang laughed, their jeers echoing off the diner's walls. Clint didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he took a small step forward, his eyes locking onto the leaders with an intensity that made the laughter falter for just a moment. "Last warning," Clint said quietly, his voice unshaken. "Back off and no one gets hurt." The leader let out a loud, sarcastic laugh, looking back at his crew for support. "You hear that, boys? He's given us a warning." He turned back to Clint, his grin wide and taunting. "What's an old man like you gonna do? Huh? Show me some kung fu moves?" Clint didn't respond. He reached up slowly, pulling off his jacket and draping it over the back of his chair. The room grew quieter as the bikers watched, their confidence wavering ever so slightly. Clint's movements were deliberate, controlled, and unhurried, a man in no rush, yet fully prepared. His quiet confidence was unsettling, and for the first time, the gang wasn't so sure what they were up against. The leader scoffed, but the slight edge in his voice betrayed him. "All right, cowboy," he said, stepping closer. "Let's see what you've got." The leader sized Clint up, his bravado swelling as he moved into striking range. "Come on, old man," he sneered, raising his fists. "Show me what you're made of." The room seemed to hold its breath. The waitress stood frozen behind the counter, her eyes wide, while the other diners huddled at their tables, too afraid to move. Even the bikers, who moments ago had been laughing and jeering, now watched in tense anticipation, unsure of how this was going to play out. The leader threw the first punch, aiming a wide swing at Clint's jaw. It was meant to humiliate, not just hurt, and the leader's overconfidence showed in the sloppy execution. But Clint was faster, much faster than anyone expected. With a smooth, fluid motion, he sidestepped the punch, the force of it cutting through empty air. Before the leader could recover, Clint's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist and twisting it with precision. A loud crack echoed through the diner as the leader let out a grunt of pain, his knees buckling as Clint forced him to the floor. The move had taken only seconds, but the effect was immediate. The diner erupted into stunned silence. The bikers stared in disbelief, their jaws hanging open as they watched their leader writhe on the ground, clutching his wrist. Clint straightened, his posture calm and composed, as if what had just happened was no more remarkable than pouring a cup of coffee. "You were saying?" Clint asked, his voice even almost casual. His gaze swept over the remaining bikers, sharp and unyielding. They shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain glances. The realization dawned on them like a cold slap to the face. This wasn't just an old man. This was someone who knew exactly how to handle himself, someone who wasn't to be trifled with. From behind the counter, the waitress let out a shaky breath, her fear giving way to awe. The other patrons, still too stunned to speak, began to murmur quietly among themselves, their whispers carrying a mix of disbelief and admiration. The bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. Clint stood his ground, unmoving, his eyes locked onto them. He didn't need to say a word. His presence alone was enough to make them think twice. The leader groaned on the floor, clutching his wrist as he glared up at Clint with a mix of anger and humiliation. The storm had begun, but Clint had already taken control of it. For a moment, there was silence. The leader groaned on the floor, still clutching his wrist, and the remaining bikers stood frozen, caught between disbelief and rage. Then, one of them, a wiry man with a snake tattoo winding down his arm, stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You're gonna regret that, old man," he growled. The wiry biker lunged, swinging wildly, but Clint was ready. With a calm step to the side, Clint deflected the punch with a sharp block, his hand snapping out to deliver a precise strike to the biker's shoulder. The man staggered back, clutching his arm, his face twisted in pain. Before he could recover, Clint swept his leg out from under him, sending him crashing to the floor. The room erupted into chaos. The remaining bikers surged forward, attacking Clint one by one. They moved with brute force, relying on their size and numbers to overwhelm him, but Clint was faster, sharper, and smarter. Each move he made was deliberate, every strike measured. He ducked under a wild swing from one biker, countering with a swift elbow to the ribs. Another grabbed a chair and swung it toward Clint, but he sidestepped effortlessly, using the man's own momentum to flip him onto the ground. The bikers weren't coordinated. They fought with aggression, but Clint fought with precision. He used their own weight and aggression against them, redirecting punches and sidestepping kicks as though he could see them coming before they were thrown. One by one, they fell, clutching ribs, limping, groaning, but still too stubborn to admit defeat. Outside, the crowd of locals that had gathered at the diner's windows erupted into cheers. The fear that had gripped them earlier was gone, replaced by awe and admiration. "He's taking them all down," someone whispered, their voice tinged with disbelief. Another shouted, "You show him, cowboy." The waitress, her hands still trembling, clutched the counter for support, her wide eyes fixed on Clint as he moved like a force of nature. The last biker standing, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, charged at Clint with a yell. Clint stood firm, waiting until the last possible moment before stepping aside and tripping him with a well-placed kick. The man hit the floor hard, the air rushing from his lungs as he lay sprawled among his defeated comrades. The fight was over. Clint straightened, brushing a speck of dust off his shirt as though nothing had happened. The gang was defeated, sprawled across the floor of the diner in various states of pain and humiliation. The leader struggled to his feet, clutching his injured wrist and glaring at Clint. "This ain't over," he spat, his voice laced with empty bravado. Clint tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady and unbothered. "It is," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. The leader muttered something under his breath before gesturing to his crew. "Let's get out of here," he barked, limping toward the door. The other bikers followed, helping each other as they stumbled out into the daylight. Their motorcycles roared to life moments later, and with one final rev of their engines, they sped off down the road, their threats dissolving into the distance. Inside the diner, the tension broke like a dam. The locals burst into applause, cheering and clapping for the man who had just saved their town from chaos. Clint, as always, remained calm. He returned to his table, pulled his chair back, and sat down. Picking up his coffee, he took a slow sip, as if the fight had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The waitress approached hesitantly, a small smile breaking through her nervous expression. I don't even know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You didn't have to do that." Clint glanced up at her, his expression softening just a touch. "Sure I did," he said simply. "Someone had to." The waitress disappeared into the kitchen for a moment and returned with a slice of pie, setting it on the table in front of Clint. "On the house," she said with a grateful smile. Clint nodded his thanks and picked up his fork as the rest of the diner patrons gathered around to express their gratitude. "You're a hero," one older man said, shaking Clint's hand. "You've done more for this town in 10 minutes than we could have done in 10 years. Clint gave a small shrug. "Just passing through," he replied, his voice calm and unassuming. As the crowd began to disperse, Clint finished his coffee and pie, his gaze drifting out the window. The roar of the bikers' motorcycles was long gone, leaving only the quiet hum of the small town once again. Clint stood, placed a few bills on the counter, and tipped his hat to the waitress. "Keep the change," he said. As he walked out into the fading sunlight, the townsfolk watched him with a mix of admiration and curiosity. To them, he was a legend, a man who had arrived without a word and left their town better than he found it. For Clint, it was just another stop on the road, another moment where doing the right thing made all the difference. The diner was calm again, the only sounds coming from the clatter of dishes and soft conversations. The townsfolk had resumed their daily routines, though the memory of the fight lingered in their minds. The tension had dissolved, but the air still carried the faint weight of what had unfolded the day before. Late that afternoon, the bell above the diner door jingled softly. Heads turned as the gang leader walked in alone. His bruised wrist was wrapped in a makeshift bandage, and his face bore the marks of the fight, scrapes, swelling, and the unmistakable shadow of humiliation. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his leather jacket hanging loose around his shoulders, his swagger noticeably absent. The waitress froze, gripping the counter nervously. A few of the locals stiffened in their seats, their earlier confidence shaken by the sight of him. But Clint, seated at his usual corner table, didn't so much as glance up. He finished his coffee with a slow sip, his calm demeanor unbroken. The leader approached Clint's table cautiously, his boots scuffing against the floor. He stopped a few feet away, shifting awkwardly before finally speaking. I wanted to talk," he muttered, his voice low and uncertain. Clint leaned back slightly, raising an eyebrow but saying nothing, inviting the man to continue. The leader cleared his throat, avoiding Clint's piercing gaze. Look, yesterday, I was out of line. We all were. I ain't gonna make excuses. We thought we could come in here, push people around, and walk away like it didn't matter. He paused, glancing at the ground. But you put me in my place. And I guess I owe you an apology. The room fell silent, the tension melting into quiet astonishment. Clint regarded the man for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke. Takes guts to admit when you're wrong, he said, his voice low but firm. You got a choice now. Keep going the way you're headed, or do something better with yourself. The leader looked up, meeting Clint's eyes for the first time. Better, huh? He said with a faint, bitter laugh. What does better even mean for someone like me? Clint leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. Respect, he said simply. Start by giving it, and you might just earn it back. The leader stood there for a moment, his face a mixture of reflection and shame. Finally, he gave a slow nod. Yeah, maybe you're right, he said quietly. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the diner, his once formidable presence reduced to a humbled retreat. The sound of his motorcycle starting up echoed down the street, but this time it felt more like closure than a threat. The sun rose early over the small desert town, casting soft pink and gold hues across the horizon. The streets were quiet, the air still and peaceful. Clint stepped out of the small motel where he'd stayed the night, his boots crunching softly against the gravel as he approached his truck. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as if the weight of the world couldn't rush him. He loaded his things into the bed of the truck and climbed into the driver's seat, pausing for a moment to glance back at the town. It was a fleeting look, one of quiet satisfaction. The chaos of the previous day felt distant now, replaced by a sense of calm that stretched through the empty streets. The townsfolk might not have seen him leave, but they would certainly remember that he'd been there. As Clint's truck rumbled to life, the waitress from the diner stepped out onto the porch. She spotted him through the haze of morning light and raised a hand in a small wave. Clint tipped his hat in return before pulling onto the road, the sound of his engine fading into the distance. Back at the diner, the story of the mysterious stranger was already making its rounds. The locals spoke of Clint with reverence, their voices tinged with a mix of awe and gratitude. He didn't just stop the bikers, one man said over coffee. He reminded us that we don't have to take that kind of trouble lying down. The waitress nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. He's a legend, she said softly, even if he doesn't want to be. Meanwhile, Clint drove on, the road stretching out endlessly ahead of him. He didn't dwell on the fight or the praise. It wasn't in his nature. Instead, he let his thoughts drift, reflecting only briefly on the events. He'd come to a town in need, done what was right, and left it better than he'd found it. That was enough. The horizon beckoned, and Clint followed, leaving behind a quiet desert town that would never forget the stranger who stood up when it mattered most. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.